Thank you, comrades of the Anti-Imperialist Front, for inviting me to participate in this important event. On behalf of my comrades from the Socialist Unity Party of the US and Struggle de Lucha newspaper, I especially want to express our solidarity with the heroic comrades on hunger strike in Turkey's prisons and the families and friends of those who have perished. We honor the revolutionary example of Helene, Ibrahim, and Mustafa, who refused to surrender their principles or their struggle for their imprisoned comrades. We stand with the people's lawyers, Ebru Timtik and Aytak Ünsal, as they pass through this very difficult and dangerous period of their hunger strike to the death. We demand that Turkey's fascist regime and its masters, US imperialism, meet the demands and stop the persecution of lawyers, musicians, and all fighters for the people. As everyone knows, the political situation in the US has changed dramatically in the past month. The militant popular uprising that followed the police murder of an unarmed black man, George Floyd, in Minneapolis, has spread rapidly to other cities. Like Comrade Mustafa Koshek, George Floyd cried out, "I can't breathe," as the capitalist state murdered him. Now this movement has reached even the smallest towns and rural areas that have not seen organized protests in generations. Yet all of these places across the US report painful examples of racist police violence against Black, Indigenous, Latin American, Asian, and Middle Eastern peoples. On May 25, the political situation in the US was this: Trump, Wall Street, Republicans and Democrats alike were forcing people back to work in unsafe conditions amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, even as the number of US deaths exceeded 100,000, and today it's closer to 120,000. But that same day, George Floyd was murdered. Just 1 week later, on June 1st, Trump was hiding in a bunker under the White House, illegally using military personnel to disperse protesters outside and threatening to declare martial law. It took only a week. For all its wealth, all its military power, for all its sanctions and military bases aimed at countries around the world, US capitalist rule is that fragile. There's been enormous repression against the protesters by the capitalist state. Police use of tear gas and other chemical weapons has been documented in at least 98 cities. Protesters have been beaten, slammed, and shot. Both police and ununiformed fascists have driven vehicles into crowds of protesters. Across the US, the state forces have adopted tactics commonly used in Israel and Chile, of shooting projectiles into the eyes of protesters. In Buffalo, New York, a 75-year-old activist was slammed to the ground by a cop. His head injury was so severe that he can no longer walk. And last week, a member of an armed fascist group allied with the police shot a protester in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Increasingly, the capitalist state relies on these white supremacist groups to threaten the unarmed people who come out in the street to demand an end to racist murders. The police continue to lash out violently as the people rise against them. Last week, police in Atlanta assaulted an unarmed black man, Rayshard Brooks, and then shot him to death in the back when he tried to flee their chokehold. Just a few days ago, an 18-year-old security guard was shot execution-style by Los Angeles sheriff's deputies as he lay on the pavement with his hands behind his head. But none of this has deterred the people, the Black and brown communities that have spent generations suffering the terrorist violence of the capitalist state, and increasingly the working class as a whole, especially the youth. On Friday, known as Juneteenth, after the day in 1865 when one of the last outposts of slavery in the US was liberated, millions of people across the US once again took to the streets to demand the defunding, disarming, and dismantling of the police. These protests have already changed the US political situation. First of all, based on previous history of police killings, we can say that Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who suffocated George Floyd, would never have been fired or charged with a crime if there had not been a powerful uprising in the city of Minneapolis that frightened the ruling class and the political establishment. And his three accomplices would not have been charged either, had it not been for the massive national and international protests that followed the rebellion in Minneapolis. Since then, the cops who shot Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta have been fired and charged with murder. Other brutal cops have also been fired. Police commissioners have resigned. This is all a result of the power of the people in the streets. Another important milestone is the establishment of a liberated zone in the city of Seattle, Washington. For the past 2 weeks, community members and activists have held a 6-block area of the city, which they call the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or CHAZ. No police or other representatives of the state are allowed entry. This has greatly frightened the ruling class, which fears it spreading to other cities. Trump has repeatedly threatened to send in the military to crush this expression of people's power. But so far, the strength of the movement and the growing divisions in the government and military have prevented them from taking action. The Pentagon generals have come to realize that the soldiers, who are mostly Black, Latino, and white workers, may well refuse their orders. The uprising caught both wings of the capitalist political establishment, the Republicans and Democrats, and all sections of the US ruling class completely off guard. And the consciousness of those participating in the protests today is much more advanced than during the original Black Lives Matter movement 5 or 6 years ago. Having gone through that experience of peaceful protests and bowing to reform politicians who were unable to make significant change, then having gone through the experience of seeing the Bernie Sanders campaign undermined by the Democratic Party establishment, young people especially are learning that both wings of the capitalist establishment are their enemies and cannot be trusted. For us, the most exciting thing is one of the most exciting things at least, is how this movement has united the oppressed Black workers with other sectors of the working class, especially young white workers, on a scale that has not been seen in a very long time. The unity of Black and white against racism is what really frightens the capitalist class here, and is driving their over-the-top repression towards the movement. Since its founding as British colonies hundreds of years ago, the US was built on a foundation of white supremacy. The capitalists built their incredible wealth, first of all, on the theft of indigenous land and the genocide of the continent's original inhabitants, and then by the labor of African slaves. And that legacy continues up to this day in the treatment of Black people and other oppressed nationalities here. The US capitalists are masters of divide and conquer against the working class. Dividing the workers with racism against Black people is the foundation stone of their rule. But now, in a few short weeks, the foundation has begun to crack in a way we haven't seen since the great working class battles of the 1930s. Beneath this new sense of class solidarity, of course, are the effects of the capitalist crisis that coincided with and were worsened by the pandemic. More than 45 million workers in the US have lost their jobs since April. And now the emergency measures that were implemented to prevent an uprising are starting to run out. Of course, we're worried about the potential for even heavier repression in the coming days and weeks. But this new militant unity against racism and the police is a very hopeful sign for the future of our class struggle here. On Friday, I spoke to hundreds of people protesting outside the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street, the headquarters of the modern-day slave owners. There I said, the police exist only to protect capitalism, the rule of the rich over the rest of us. The only way to get rid of the racist police system is to abolish capitalism. The only way to get there is to fight for socialism, for self-determination for the Black nation, for the workers and poor people to establish our own forms of government and self-defense. Our demands to defund, disarm, and dismantle the police are not the goal, but the first step. Thank you for your solidarity, comrades. Together we will win.